At dawn on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale sky, a calm blue desert concealing two vast armadas creeping toward one another, unaware that within mere hours one of them would cease to exist, and the balance of the world would shift forever. For months, Japan had ruled these waters unchallenged, its fleet a symbol of imperial perfection, its carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, the sharpest edge of a triumphant empire that had swept from the South China Sea to the edge of Hawaii. Yet, as the sun climbed higher above the waves, the illusion of invincibility began to crack. For high above the atoll of Midway, American scouts were already tracking them, guided not by chance or luck, but by the silent work of codebreakers who had unlocked the enemy's intentions before the battle had even begun. The calm was deceptive. Every man aboard those ships felt it, the suffocating tension that came before history's turning point. On the Akagi, flight decks thundered with organized chaos as Japanese crews prepared aircraft for another strike on Midway, unaware that their enemies were already closing in from the northeast. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the humid air, and on every deck, sailors hurried to rearm torpedoes and bombs, believing they had hours to strike again. They did not. They had 13 minutes. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, aboard the Enterprise and Yorktown, the decks of American carriers pulsed with a different rhythm. Steady, deliberate, fueled by nerves but anchored in discipline. Pilots checked their altimeters and oxygen lines, while officers whispered final instructions. In those quiet moments before takeoff, few understood that what they were about to do would define the entire Pacific War. And as the engines roared to life, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky looked across his squadron and knew this was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Because history isn't written in years. It's written in moments like these. The calm before the storm was ending, and the greatest carrier battle in history was about to begin. Aboard the Akagi, flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy's first air fleet, the morning light glimmered on polished brass and steel, illuminating a fleet at the height of its power. For 6 months, these carriers had dominated the Pacific, their pilots veterans of Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, and the Java Sea, their commanders convinced that the gods themselves had sanctioned their victories. Admiral Nagumo, a man of cautious temperament but unyielding discipline, stood on the bridge beside his staff, gazing eastward through his binoculars at an ocean that appeared as calm as his composure. Reports from his scouts were incomplete, but confidence filled the air like incense in a temple. America, it was believed, had only 2 carriers left, and both would surely fall before the day was out. Below deck, the routine of victory carried on like clockwork. Mechanics armed Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers for a second strike on Midway itself. The first attack had crippled the island's defenses, but Nagumo wanted absolute destruction. His decision, however, was split by uncertainty. Messages from reconnaissance planes hinted that American ships might be nearby, but the locations were vague, the timing uncertain. On one side of his bridge, his staff urged him to keep his aircraft armed for ship attack. On the other, his air officer, Genda, advised rearming for a second assault on Midway. The admiral hesitated. That hesitation would soon cost him everything. While crews below swapped torpedoes for bombs, removing live warheads and refueling planes amid a jungle of hoses and munitions, the clock ticked relentlessly toward disaster. The flight decks were a maze of motion, men shouting orders, forklifts clanging metal, and the heavy scent of gasoline hanging like a warning that no one could yet recognize. To the Japanese crews, this was merely efficiency. To fate, it was preparation for annihilation. In the radio room, officers decoded fragments from their scouts. 10 enemy ships sighted. The words hit like a spark, and Nagumo's heart tightened. Were these ships carriers? Cruisers? Was it a feint? His doctrine demanded confirmation before committing his planes, and so he delayed, minutes stretching into eternity as crews kept working on decks that had become floating powder kegs. Far to the northeast, unseen in the distance, American dive bombers were already forming up, guided by sheer instinct and luck, sharpened by codebreakers' genius. The Japanese fleet believed it had time. It had 13 minutes less than it thought. The air grew heavier with every passing second, and as the carrier Kaga turned into the wind, her deck filled with armed aircraft and open fuel lines, history's deadliest trap was silently closing. Thousands of miles away from the tension brewing aboard Akagi, in a dimly lit room buried deep within Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, a handful of cryptanalysts labored over fragments of intercepted Japanese transmissions, their desks cluttered with code sheets, radio intercepts, and ashtrays filled from sleepless nights. Among them was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a quiet man with a wrinkled uniform, a dry wit, and an extraordinary mind that had pieced together what even Japan's admirals did not yet know, that the target called AF in Japanese communications was not some distant island, but Midway itself. It had taken weeks of patient deception, culminating in a ruse where Midway's garrison sent an unencrypted message complaining of a broken water system. When Japanese code referenced AF short on water, the truth was confirmed, and with it, Admiral Chester Nimitz found his opportunity to strike first. Nimitz, sitting in his modest office overlooking Pearl Harbor's still-scarred waters, made a decision that defied logic and precedent. He would not wait for confirmation through reconnaissance. He would move his carriers north of Midway and prepare an ambush, trusting the word of his cryptanalysts more than the guns of his fleet. It was a gamble of intellect over instinct, of patience over firepower, and it would decide the future of the Pacific. By June 3rd, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were at sea, their decks alive with activity, their pilots briefed on a mission cloaked in silence. They didn't yet know how close they were to destiny. Below decks, sailors played cards beside torpedoes and whispered rumors about the Japanese fleet's size. Above them, aircrews studied maps marked with circles and arrows, tracing routes to an enemy they had never seen but were about to meet in battle. The morning of June 4th began with a rising sense of inevitability. Reports from PBY Catalinas confirmed Japanese ships approaching from the northwest. At 5:30 a.m., Nimitz's plan was already unfolding exactly as predicted. The Japanese had taken the bait. From the bridge of the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance gave the order to prepare for launch. Below, engines roared to life, propellers spun, and the smell of oil and seawater mixed with anticipation. The carriers began turning into the wind, ready to send forth their entire striking force. What followed would be not a duel of ships, but a collision of foresight and fate, a battle decided not by who struck first, but by who understood where and when the enemy would strike at all. The morning sun had barely lifted over the Pacific when the first wave of American torpedo planes took to the sky. Their mission: locate and strike the heart of the Japanese fleet. Yet for the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, there was no illusion about what awaited them. Their aircraft, the outdated TBD Devastators, were slow, underarmed, and nearly defenseless against the Zero fighters guarding the Japanese carriers. But Waldron, a Sioux warrior at heart and a naval officer by duty, believed in the value of action even when death was certain. "If there's only one plane left to make a run," he told his men, "I want that man to go in and get a hit." At 9:20 a.m., Torpedo 8 descended through broken clouds, their formation tight, engines droning low over the ocean's shimmering expanse. They found the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, maneuvering gracefully in battle formation. But as soon as the Devastators broke through the horizon, the sky erupted. Dozens of Zeros dived from above, shredding the formation before the Americans even reached torpedo range. One by one, the Devastators went down in smoke and flame. The sea swallowed men and metal alike. Of the 15 planes that launched, none returned. At nearly the same moment, Torpedo Squadrons 3 and 6 arrived from the Yorktown and Enterprise. They too met the same fate, flying low and slow, cutting through walls of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese gunners, drilled to perfection, filled the sky with lead. Pilots shouted prayers, smoke-filled cockpits, and explosions turned the air thick with debris. But their sacrifice, unseen, unrecorded in that instant, was not in vain. While the Japanese focused entirely on the low-flying torpedo planes, their carriers began turning hard to avoid incoming torpedoes, forcing their flight decks to remain cluttered with refueling and rearming aircraft. The combat air patrols had been drawn to sea level, leaving the sky above vulnerable, and it was in that very moment of chaos that the tide of the Pacific War turned. At 10:20 a.m., a second group of attackers, SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, emerged from the clouds at 19,000 feet. Below them lay a target-rich sea, carriers exposed, decks crowded, and no Zeros left above to defend them. The torpedo squadrons had been annihilated, but in their deaths, they had opened the heavens. The next minutes would rewrite history, not through strategy, but through sacrifice. At precisely 10:20 a.m., the silence above the clouds fractured as the dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown rolled into their attack. The pilots, sweating inside their cockpits, could see the sprawling Japanese fleet below, 4 carriers spread across a canvas of blue water, each one bristling with aircraft and anti-aircraft guns. In the chaos of the previous torpedo assaults, the Japanese had been forced to refuel and rearm their planes simultaneously, leaving decks covered in bombs, gasoline hoses, and rows of vulnerable aircraft. What had once been a fortress was now a floating powder keg, waiting for a single spark. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky led the Enterprise's dive bombers in a steep descent toward the Kaga. The roar of wind filled his canopy as he pushed his SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive, the altimeter spinning wildly. Below, the carrier's deck was crowded with armed planes and crewmen sprinting for cover. McClusky lined up his target, released his bomb at 2,000 feet, and pulled up with a shuddering groan from his aircraft. Moments later, a blinding orange flash erupted. One bomb hit near the midsection, igniting aviation fuel and detonating ordnance stacked on deck. Within seconds, Kaga was engulfed in a rising inferno, its metal skin warping under the sheer heat. To the north, Lieutenant Dick Best and his section zeroed in on the Akagi, the Japanese flagship. Best's bomb struck with surgical precision, piercing the flight deck, slicing through to the hangar, and igniting torpedoes stored below. The explosion tore the heart out of the ship. Flames burst upward, devouring men and aircraft in an instant. Admiral Nagumo, who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, stood in disbelief as his command ship became an inferno before his eyes. Meanwhile, Yorktown's bombers struck Sōryū. 3 direct hits shattered the carrier's deck and sent shockwaves through its internal fuel stores. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's mightiest carriers were mortally wounded, their decks transformed into towering columns of smoke. The sea that had once glimmered with sunlight now burned with oil and fire. The pilots of the Dauntlesses pulled up, their ears ringing from the roar of explosions. Through the haze, they could see the blackened skeletons of ships that had once seemed invincible. In that brief window, just 5 minutes, the balance of the Pacific shifted irreversibly. Below them, sailors leapt into the flaming sea, while distant cruisers rushed to rescue survivors. The Japanese Empire, once untouchable, was now bleeding at its core. While Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū burned into the Pacific horizon, one carrier still remained, Hiryū, Flying Dragon, the last operational heart of Nagumo's striking force. Aboard her steel decks, Captain Tomeo Kaku and Air Officer Commander Mitsuo Kobayashi knew that their fleet's survival depended entirely on them. Smoke from the southern horizon smeared the sky, black and heavy, yet the crew worked with mechanical precision, arming their planes amid the lingering shock of what had just unfolded. Every man aboard understood that vengeance was now their duty. By 10:45 a.m., the first wave, 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros, roared into the air, their engines straining under full throttle. The target, the American carrier Yorktown, whose presence had been identified by a surviving scout. From the cockpit of his Val, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi could still see the flames of his country's ruined carriers flickering on the sea behind him, a sight that hardened his resolve. The Japanese formation climbed to altitude, slicing through the wind in tight formation as the last functioning link of the Kido Butai hurled itself into the counterstrike. At 12:20 p.m., lookouts aboard Yorktown spotted glints in the sun, enemy planes approaching from the northwest. Alarms echoed across the decks as sailors sprinted to battle stations. The ship's crew, already weary from the morning's flight operations, braced for impact. The first dive bombers plunged through anti-aircraft bursts, their wings vibrating under tracer fire. At 12:42, a Val dropped its 550-pound bomb dead center on Yorktown's flight deck. The explosion tore open steel plating, sent burning debris into the sky, and knocked men to their knees. Within moments, a second bomb ripped through to the hangar deck, igniting planes lined with fuel. Smoke rose like a signal of defiance, visible for miles. But Yorktown refused to die easily. Damage control teams fought back with relentless discipline, pumping seawater, sealing ruptures, and extinguishing fires with a precision that astonished even Japanese observers. Admiral Fletcher temporarily shifted his flag to the cruiser Astoria, believing his carrier might be lost, yet the crew stabilized her within an hour. To the Americans, this resilience became symbolic, proof that training and resolve could withstand the fiercest assault. When reconnaissance planes returned to Hiryū, their pilots carried both triumph and dread. They had crippled an American carrier, but the enemy still had multiple decks launching planes. Kaku ordered a second strike, torpedo bombers this time, to finish the job. As the sun dipped toward the Pacific, the Flying Dragon prepared to breathe fire once more, unaware that American dive bombers were already tracing her position through the darkening clouds. By late afternoon, the Pacific air hung thick with the residue of burning oil and drifting ash, a grim reminder of the carnage that had unfolded only hours earlier. Yet amid the haze, one ship still moved with defiance, the Hiryū. Her flight deck was alive with ordered chaos as armorers loaded torpedoes and fueled aircraft for a second and final counterstrike. Captain Tomeo Kaku knew their odds were nearly hopeless, but the spirit of the Kido Butai demanded retaliation until the very end. The crew moved with a mechanical resolve born of fatalism. The rising sun still fluttered from the stern, though every man aboard understood it might soon sink beneath the waves. At 2:30 p.m., Hiryū launched her second wave, 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. Their target remained Yorktown, believed to be mortally wounded. As they approached, they were met by the carrier's recovering fighters and a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Despite the storm of shells, 2 torpedoes struck home. The first hit Yorktown amidships, the second near her boilers, killing power and freezing her engines. She listed sharply to port, her once proud deck tilting toward the sea. Admiral Fletcher transferred his command again, while crews fought to contain flooding and flames. To observers aboard the Hiryū, the sight of Yorktown dead in the water felt like retribution fulfilled, a dying gasp of vengeance for their fallen comrades. But fate was not finished. Even as Hiryū's airmen celebrated, U.S. scout planes had already found her. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McClusky, whose dive bombers had shattered Kaga that morning, now vectored new squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown toward her coordinates. At 5:03 p.m., they sighted the lone carrier, steaming north under a column of smoke. The Hiryū's anti-aircraft guns opened up instantly, dotting the sky with black bursts, but it was too late. The dauntless dive bombers rolled into their descent from 14,000 feet. Bombs screamed downward, slicing through the clouds. 4 direct hits tore through Hiryū's deck, igniting planes fueled and armed for a third strike. Flames leapt high, swallowing the bridge and hangar in a single roaring sweep. Men hurled themselves into the sea to escape the inferno. Captain Kaku remained on the bridge, refusing evacuation. As night fell, the Flying Dragon was still burning, her glow visible across the dark ocean like a funeral pyre. By dawn, Hiryū was gone, slipping beneath the waves at 5:10 a.m., taking more than 400 men with her. With her loss, Japan's once invincible carrier force had ceased to exist. The Kido Butai, the same formation that had terrorized the Pacific at Pearl Harbor, was no more. By the time the sun sank below the horizon on June 4, 1942, the Pacific had grown eerily quiet. The once thunderous symphony of engines, explosions, and gunfire faded into the rhythmic hiss of waves lapping against burning wreckage. Smoke still coiled upward from the distant carcasses of Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, 4 leviathans of the Imperial Navy reduced to drifting pyres. Oil slicks stretched for miles, glistening like molten glass, and scattered across them were hundreds of Japanese sailors clinging to debris, their faces illuminated by the faint orange glow of their dying ships. The battle that had begun in fury now ended in silence, a silence that carried the weight of an empire's unraveling. Rescue efforts unfolded hesitantly amid the chaos. Japanese destroyers, some half-crippled themselves, moved through the wreckage, hauling survivors aboard while dodging the threat of American submarines. The men rescued were burned, shell-shocked, or floating in stunned disbelief, many still gripping flight deck tools or navigation charts as though duty refused to die with the ship. Among them were junior officers who had seen their carriers, the pride of Japan's naval aviation, consumed within minutes. They whispered that the gods had turned their faces away, that no warrior code could shield them from the precision and discipline of their American foes. Far to the east, the U.S. task force tended to its own wounded. Yorktown lay stricken but not yet dead, listing heavily as damage control teams worked tirelessly in the flicker of lanterns. Admiral Spruance, commanding from Enterprise, maintained silence across the fleet, a silence not of relief, but of solemn acknowledgement. They had achieved the impossible, yet every man knew the cost. Scores of torpedo bomber crews lay at the bottom of the sea, their sacrifice having drawn Japan's fighters low and cleared the skies for the decisive dive-bombing attack. It was a victory purchased with courage, rather than fortune. Night cloaked the Pacific in a dark shroud, broken only by the flickering remains of burning oil. Sharks cut slow circles through the blackened water. For Japanese survivors adrift on rafts, every hour became a struggle against exhaustion and despair. Some sang the national anthem through cracked lips. Others simply watched the smoke drift toward the stars, realizing they would never again see their homeland. When dawn finally broke over the Midway atoll, it revealed a sea scarred by destruction, and a world forever changed. The Imperial Navy's aura of invincibility had vanished beneath those waves. When the smoke cleared from the Pacific horizon, the reality of what had transpired began to settle upon both fleets like a heavy fog. For the Japanese survivors pulled from the sea, disbelief mingled with humiliation. They had lived through the destruction of the Kido Butai, the pride of their nation, the sword with which Japan had carved its empire. In the dim infirmary of a destroyer, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi stared blankly at his bandaged hands, once steady at the controls of a dive bomber. Around him, sailors wept openly, not merely for their lost comrades, but for the death of an illusion. The empire that had struck fear across the Pacific now faced an enemy whose resolve and intelligence had proven equal to its ferocity. Officers who had worshipped the spirit of Bushido found themselves crushed beneath the weight of modern warfare's unforgiving logic. Courage was powerless against superior planning. In Tokyo, the news was met with stunned silence. The Imperial Navy, once celebrated for its flawless victories, now concealed the magnitude of its loss from the public. Official reports claimed only one carrier damaged, but in secret chambers, Admiral Yamamoto read the true dispatches with a trembling hand. 4 fleet carriers gone, 3,000 trained airmen lost, an entire strategic arm severed in a single day. He understood what few dared to speak aloud. Japan had lost not merely ships, but time, pilots, and initiative. The Pacific would never again tilt in their favor. The Empire's reach had outgrown its endurance. Across the ocean, aboard Enterprise, the mood was equally complex. There was triumph, yes, but also exhaustion and grief. Many of the airmen who had delivered the victory never returned. Flight crews gathered quietly on deck as chaplains read prayers over the sea, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns and the faint reflection of burning oil still drifting miles away. Wade McClusky and his surviving pilots received quiet commendations, but they carried an invisible burden, the haunting knowledge that their success had been made possible by the sacrifice of dozens of torpedo crews who had gone down in flames. For every cheer that echoed across the mess halls, there was an unspoken sorrow. Historians would later call Midway the hinge of fate, a moment when industrial calculation overcame imperial pride. But for those who lived it, the meaning was simpler. It was the day the ocean reminded mankind that courage alone could not command destiny. In the decades that followed, historians would dissect every maneuver, every misjudged signal, and every fateful minute of June 4, 1942. Yet no analysis, however meticulous, could fully capture the magnitude of what transpired within those 13 minutes between 10:20 and 10:33 a.m., the brief span in which the tide of the Pacific War turned irreversibly. What had begun as another daring Japanese offensive ended as a masterclass in how intelligence, discipline, and timing could overturn even the mightiest of empires. The Battle of Midway was not merely a contest of ships and planes. It was a collision between two ways of thinking, one steeped in tradition and instinct, the other forged in code-breaking, coordination, and calculated risk. The Japanese had entered Midway confident that they would replicate the success of Pearl Harbor, believing that courage and experience would compensate for uncertainty. But Admiral Nagumo's fatal indecision, his choice to rearm aircraft amid conflicting intelligence, left his fleet exposed at its most vulnerable moment. When McClusky's and Best's squadrons descended from the heavens, they did more than destroy carriers. They dismantled the illusion of invincibility that had defined the Imperial Navy. Those plumes of fire rising from the Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū symbolized the shattering of a doctrine, the moment when centuries of martial confidence collided with the precision of modern warfare. For the United States, Midway became a validation of strategy over spectacle. The victory was not the product of luck, but of preparation. The cryptanalysts at Station Hypo, who broke the Japanese code, the engineers who designed machines that could survive impossible dives, and the sailors who fought to keep battered decks operational under relentless assault. Each decision, from Admiral Nimitz's gamble on carrier positioning to McClusky's fateful turn north, contributed to an orchestration so precise it bordered on destiny. In the years that followed, the 4 carriers lost at Midway, ships that had carried Japan's empire across the Pacific, were never replaced. Their loss forced Japan onto the defensive, drained its elite air crews, and gave the United States the initiative that would carry through to the Marianas, the Philippines, and ultimately to Tokyo Bay. The war that had begun in surprise at Pearl Harbor would end in surrender 3 years later, on the deck of an American carrier. And so, those 13 minutes stand as a reminder that wars are not won solely by strength or bravery, but by clarity of thought and the courage to act within the smallest window of opportunity, before the tide once again begins to turn.